One night, Henry and Gordon were alone with James. Although Sir Topham Hatt was beginning to think well of him, whenever a chance came, the other engines would talk of nothing but bootlaces. "Remember when they had to use a bootlace to get you out of trouble, James?" they would tease. James tried to get back by talking about Henry, who got shut up in a tunnel, and Gordon, who got stuck on a hill, but they wouldn't listen. "You talk too much, little James," said Gordon. "A fine, strong engine like me has something to talk about. I'm the only engine who can pull the express. When I'm not there, they need two engines. Think of that. I've pulled expresses for years and have never once lost my way. I seem to know the right line by instinct." Every wise engine knows that the signalman sets the switches to make the engines run on the right tracks. But Gordon was so proud he had forgotten. "Wake up, James," said Gordon next morning. "It's time for the express. What are you doing? Odd jobs? Oh, well, we all have to begin somewhere, don't we? Run along and get my coaches. Don't be late." James went to get Gordon's coaches. They were all shining with new paint. He was careful not to bump them, and they followed him smoothly into the station, singing happily, "We're going away! We're going away!" "I wish I were going with you," said James. "I should love to pull the express and go flying along the line." Gordon, with much noise and blowing of steam, got ready to back onto the train. Sir Topham Hatt was on the train with other important people, and as soon as they heard the conductor's whistle, Gordon started. "Look at me now, he puffed, and the coaches glided after him. "Goodbye, little James. See you tomorrow." James watched the train disappear and then went back to work. He pushed some freight cars into their proper sidings and went to fetch the coaches for another train. James had just brought the coaches to the platform when he heard a mournful noise. There was Gordon trying to sneak into the station without being noticed. "Hello, Gordon. Is it tomorrow?" Gordon didn't answer. He just let off steam feebly. "Did you lose your way, Gordon?" "No, it was lost for me. I was switched off the main line onto the loop. I had to go all round and back again." "Perhaps it was instinct," said James. All the passengers were shouting at the ticket window, "We want our money back." Sir Topham Hatt climbed onto a cart and blew the conductor's whistle so loudly that they all stopped to look at him. Then he promised them a new train at once. "Gordon can't do it. Will you pull it for us, James?" "Yes, sir. I'll try." So James was coupled on and everyone got in. "Do your best, James," said Sir Topham Hatt. Come along, puffed James. "You're pulling us well, sang the coaches. Hurry, puffed James. Bridges and stations flashed by. The passengers cheered, and they soon reached the station. Everyone said thank you to James, and Sir Topham Hatt was very impressed. "Well done. Would you like to pull the express sometimes?" "Yes, please," answered James. Next day, when James came by, Gordon was pushing freight cars. "I like some quiet work for a change," he said. "I'm teaching these cars manners. You did well with those coaches, I hear." "Good. We'll show them." And he gave his cars a bump. James and Gordon are now good friends. James sometimes takes the express to give Gordon a rest. Gordon never talks about bootlaces, and they're both quite agreed on the subject of freight cars. Toby and Henrietta were enjoying their new job on the island of Sodor, but they do look old-fashioned and did need new paint. James was very rude whenever he saw them. "Yuck! What dirty objects," he would say. At last, Toby lost patience. "James," he asked, "why are you red?" "I am a splendid engine," answered James, "ready for anything." You never see my paint dirty. Oh, said Toby innocently. That's why you once needed bootlaces, to be ready, I suppose. James went redder than ever and snorted off. It was such an insult to be reminded of the time a bootlace had been used to mend a hole in his coaches. At the end of the line, James left his coaches and got ready for his next train. It was a slow freight, stopping at every station to pick up and set down cars. James hated slow freight trains. Dirty cars from dirty siding. Yeah! Starting with only a few, he picked up more and more cars at each station till he had a long train. At first, the freight cars behaved well, but James bumped them so crossly that they were determined to get back at him. Presently, they approached the top of Gordon's Hill. Heavy freight trains halt here to set their brakes. James had had an accident with cars before and should have remembered this. "Wait, James, wait," said the driver, but James wouldn't wait. He was too busy thinking what he would say to Toby when they next met. The freight car's chance had come. "Hurrah! Hurrah!" they laughed, and banging their bumpers, they pushed him down the hill. "On! On!" yelled the cars. "I've got to stop! I've got to stop!" groaned James. Disaster lay ahead. Something sticky splashed all over James. He had run into 2 tar wagons and was black from smokebox to cab. He was more dirty than hurt. But the tar wagons and some cars were all to pieces. Toby and Percy were sent to help and came as quickly as they could. "Look here, Percy," exclaimed Toby. "Whatever is that dirty object? That's James, didn't you know?" "It's James's shape," said Toby. "But James is a splendid red engine, and you never see his paint dirty." James pretended he hadn't heard. Toby and Percy cleared away the unhurt cars and helped James home. Sir Topham Hatt met them. "Well done, Percy and Toby." He turned to James. "Fancy letting your cars run away. I am surprised. You're not fit to be seen. You must be cleaned at once. Toby shall have a new coat of paint." "Please, sir, can Henrietta have one too?" said Toby. "Certainly, Toby." "Oh, thank you, sir. She will be pleased." All James could do was watch Toby as he ran off happily with the news. James is a mixed traffic engine. He can pull both freight cars and coaches. He's proud of his smart red paint, and so is his driver. Everyone says you brighten up their day, James. One morning, James whistled loudly at the other engines. "Look at me. I am the smartest, most useful engine on the line." "Rubbish," replied Thomas. "We're all useful. Sir Topham Hatt says so, and he's head of the whole railway." "You know what, James?" added Percy. "What?" replied James. "You're getting all puffed up." James huffed away. Later, he was still boasting. "I'm the pride of the line." "I saw you pulling freight cars," snorted Gordon. "You're only a goods engine." "I pull coaches, too." "Not as much as I do." But Sir Topham Hatt has plans for me. James was only making this up, but Gordon believed him. What plans? Wait and see. Oh dear, he thought. Now what'll I do? Thomas was shunting shining new coaches. Good morning, James. Are those coaches for me? Asked James hopefully. No, these are for Gordon's Express. I'll fetch your freight cars next. But James was going to play a trick on the other engines. Actually, Thomas, I'm taking the coaches. Sir Topham Hatt asked me to tell you. What about the cars? Asked Thomas. Give them to Gordon. Come on, Thomas, said his driver. Orders are orders. So when James's driver returned, James was coupled to the coaches and he puffed away. Thomas returned with the freight cars, and a few minutes later, Gordon arrived. Where's the express? Thomas told him about James, and so here are your cars. Gordon was very cross, and so was his driver. Wait till Sir Topham Hatt hears about this. Meanwhile, James was enjoying himself enormously. What a clever plan! What a clever plan! He chuffed. Then he saw Sir Topham Hatt. Some jokes are funny, but not this one, James. You have caused confusion. Yes, sir, said James. You will now stay in your shed until you are wanted. The other engines teased James. I wonder who'll be pulling the express today, said Gordon. I expect it'll be you, replied Henry. James is stuck in the shed for being silly. James felt sad. Next morning, he went back to work. Hello, whistled Thomas. Good to see you out and about again. I'm sorry I tricked you, said James. Are these my cars? Yes, replied Thomas kindly. They are pleased to have you back. James set off to the harbor with his train of freight cars. He bustled about all day, pushing and pulling them into place. Time to go home now, James, said his driver at last. No cars or passengers, just we two. But his driver was wrong. Excuse me, called a man. I have a meeting with Sir Topham Hatt, and I mustn't be late. May I ride back with you? Of course, replied James's driver. Then he whispered to James, This gentleman is a railway inspector. James was most impressed. He steamed along the line as smoothly and quickly as he could. Sir Topham Hatt was waiting on the platform, and the railway inspector greeted him warmly. This clever engine gave me a splendid ride. You must be proud of him. Yes, indeed. Once again, you are a really useful engine.
One day, James had to wait at the station till Edward and his train came in. This made him cross. Late again! Edward laughed, and James fumed away. After James had finished his work, he went back to the yard and puffed onto the turntable. He was still feeling very bad-tempered. Edward is impossible, he grumbled to the others. He clanks about like a lot of old iron, and he is so slow, he makes us wait. Thomas and Percy were indignant. Old iron? Slow? Why, Edward could beat you in a race any day. Really, said James. I should like to see him do it. Next morning, James's driver was suddenly taken ill. He could hardly stand, so the fireman uncoupled James ready for shunting. James was impatient. Suddenly, the signalman shouted. There was James puffing away down the line. All traffic halted, called the signalman. Then he told the fireman what had happened. Two boys were on James's footplate fiddling with the controls. Whew. They tumbled off and ran when James started. The signalman answered the telephone. Yes? He's here. Right. I'll tell him. The inspector's coming at once. He wants a shunter's pole and a coil of wire rope. What for? Wondered the fireman. Search me, but you'd better get them quickly. The fireman was ready when Edward arrived. The inspector saw the pole and the rope. Good man, jump in. We'll catch him, puffed Edward. James was laughing. What a lark, he chuckled to himself. Suddenly, he was going faster and faster. He realized that he had no driver. What shall I do? I can't stop. Help! Help! We're coming, called Edward. Edward was panting up behind with every ounce of steam he had. At last, he caught up with James. Steady, Edward, called his driver. The inspector stood on Edward's front, holding a noose of rope and the crook of the shunter's pole. He was trying to slip it over James's buffer. The engine swayed and lurched. At last, got him, he shouted. He pulled the noose tight. Gently braking, Edward's driver checked the engine speed, and James's fireman scrambled across and took control. So, the old iron caught you after all, chuckled Edward. I'm sorry, whispered James. Thank you for saving me. You were splendid, Edward. That's all right, replied Edward. The engines arrived at the station side by side. Sir Topham Hatt was waiting. A fine piece of work, he said. James, you can rest and then take your train. I'm proud of you, Edward. You shall go to the works and have your worn parts mended. Oh, thank you, sir, said Edward. It'll be lovely not to clank.
James was enjoying his life on the island of Soda, but he still had a lot to learn. You're a special mixed traffic engine, said Sir Topham Hatt. You can pull coaches or freight cars quite easily, but you must learn by your mistakes. James knew what Sir Topham Hatt meant. He could well remember that dreadful accident on his first day. Be careful with the coaches, James, said kind little Edward. They don't like being bumped. Everyone came to admire James. I'm really a splendid engine, he thought, and suddenly let off steam. Whoosh! A shower of water fell on Sir Topham's nice new top hat. Just then the conductor blew his whistle, and James thought they had better go. Go on, he puffed to Edward. Don't push, replied Edward. The coaches were grumbling too. Don't go so fast, But James didn't listen. When at last they stopped at the next station, two coaches were beyond the platform. They had to go back to let the passengers out. But no one seemed to know about Sir Topham's new hat, so James felt happier. Presently, they came to the station where Thomas was waiting with his two coaches. Hello, James, said Thomas. Feeling better? That's good. Oh, that's my conductor's whistle. I must go. I don't know what Sir Topham Hatt would do without me to run this branch line. I puffed off importantly. Edward and James passed the field where James had had his accident. The fence was mended and the cows were back again. They ended their journey and rested before setting off for home. James was still wondering what Sir Topham would have to say about his new hat. Next morning, he spoke severely to James. "If you can't behave, I shall take away your red coat and have you painted blue." James didn't like that at all. He was very rough at the grumbling coaches as he brought them to the platform. "Don't talk, come on." Gordon never has to fetch his own coaches, he thought to himself, and he's only painted blue. To make James even more cross, this time no one came near him. "I'll show them," he thought. "They think Gordon is the only engine who can pull coaches." "Hurry, hurry, hurry," puffed James. "You're going too fast, you're going too fast," replied the coaches. James laughed and tried to go faster, but the coaches wouldn't let him. "We're going to stop, we're going to stop." "What's the matter?" James asked his driver. "The brakes are on. Leak in the pipe, most likely. You've banged the coaches enough to make a leak in anything." "How shall we mend it?" said the conductor. "We'll do it with newspaper and a leather bootlace," replied the driver. "But where is the bootlace coming from?" asked the conductor. "Ask the passengers," said the driver. "You have a leather bootlace there," said the conductor to a smartly dressed man. "Please give it to me." "I won't." "Then I'm afraid the train will just stop where it is." The passengers all said what a bad railway it was. Then they told the man how bad he was instead. Everyone was very cross. At last he handed his laces over. The driver tied a pad of newspaper tightly round the hole in the brake pipe, and James was able to pull the train. But he was a sadder and wiser James who took care never to bump coaches again. It was a splendid morning on the island of Sodor. James was feeling very pleased with himself. His red paint gleamed in the sunshine as he sped along the line. He reached the junction just as Percy puffed in with some freight cars. James was surprised to see him. "What are you doing here, Percy? You should be at the station by now." "I know," sighed Percy. "These cars have been troublesome all morning." "That's no excuse, Percy. Nothing should stop us. Sir Topham Hatt relies on us to be on time. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'll be on my way." And James puffed importantly away. "Bossy buffers," muttered Percy. James arrived at the harbor. It was market day. The harbor yard was filled with the sweet smell of fruit from faraway lands. The fruit was delivered in big ships. James watched as strawberries, oranges, melons, and bananas were carefully loaded onto his cars. Then he set off for the station on the main line. On the way, he met Thomas. "Really reliable, that's me," panted James. "Pity the same can't be said for Percy. Goodbye." "What was all that about?" gasped Annie and Clarabelle. "That was trouble. Trouble for James. Just wait and see." Percy was back in the yard and busy shunting. He had the cars in good order and was making up for lost time. But the station master had bad news. "What's happened?" asked Percy's driver. "James's brakes have jammed. We need Percy's help right away." Percy quickly set off to the rescue. James was stuck on the line and looking glum. Percy couldn't help laughing. "Got yourself in a bit of a jam, eh, James? A sticky situation?" "Be quiet. It's not funny having jammed brakes." "And not very reliable either. I'm surprised you let it happen, James. Nothing should stop us engines." "That's enough, Percy," said the driver. "Can you push these cars?" "Of course I can. There's no time to lose. James has done too much of that already." James angrily hissed steam as Percy was coupled to the cars. "Off we go," said Percy. "I'll have to go fast to get there in time. Those big engines are so unreliable." "Be careful, Percy," called his driver, but Percy was in a hurry. He didn't see that the switch had failed and that he had been diverted into a siding. "Look out, Percy!" shouted his driver and applied the brakes, but it was too late. The driver and fireman had jumped clear, but squashed fruit squirted all over Percy. Sir Topham had arrived. "Percy, you are not to blame for the switch failure, but I do not run a jam factory." "Yes, sir. No, sir." And Percy squelched sadly away. That night, the shed was silent. James and Percy felt very sorry for themselves. At last, Thomas spoke. "You know," he said to no engine in particular, "there's more than one way to get jammed. We all learned that today." Still, there was silence. What's more, we also learned that sometimes when engines help each other out of a jam, things can still go wrong. "So," said a voice, "so, that means we learned a lot today, and therefore..." Then came a chorus. "We're really useful engines after all." Trevor the traction engine was enjoying his work in the vicarage orchard. Birds were singing and apples were ripening on the trees. It was a lovely day. "Hello, Trevor," said James. "You look as bright and cheerful as my red paint." "Oh, I am," replied Trevor. "What's that noise?" "It's the bees," laughed Trevor. "They're all in these boxy things called beehives. I'm taking them to the station. The vicar says his bees make good honey, and he's giving some of them to his friends." Just then, Boko, the diesel engine, hummed in. "Take care, you two. Don't make the bees angry. They might sting you." James didn't like being told what to do by a diesel, and he buzzed away. "Goodbye, Trevor," called Boko, and set off to see Duck at the next station. Bill and Ben, the tank engine twins, were busy arranging cars, but they scampered off when they saw Boko. "I remember the first time I met those two," laughed Boko. "They nearly made my eyes pop out. Ed would soon put a stop to their games." "Edward is the only one who can keep Bill and Ben in order," chuckled Duck. "I sometimes call them the bees." "A good name," replied Boko. "They're terrors when they start buzzing around." James bustled in. "What's that, Duck? Are you afraid of bees? They're only insects after all, so don't let that buzzbox diesel tell you different." "His name is Boko, and he didn't. I wouldn't care if hundreds were swarming around. I'd just blow smoke and make them buzz off." "Buzz, buzz, buzz," retorted Duck. The next morning, James arrived at the station to collect his coaches. The passengers were excited and keen to get on board. The platform was crowded, and the porter was in a hurry. "Mind your backs," he shouted. Then there was trouble. The beehive fell and broke open. The station cleared like magic. James heard a familiar buzzing. The bees were too cold to be cross, so they buzzed around the fireman, hoping he'd mend their hive. But he didn't understand, nor did his driver, so the bees turned to James. His boiler was nice and warm. "Buzz off," hissed James. One bee burnt his foot. "Ooh, ah, ah, ooh." The bee thought James had burnt him on purpose. So it stung James right back on the nose. "Eee! whistled James. He had had enough. So had his fireman and driver. They didn't notice till too late that they had left all their coaches behind. They tried everything to get rid of the bees. First they spun on the turntable, but to no avail. They tried washing them off, but the bees clung harder to James's warm boiler. Then they tried smoking them off by going through a long tunnel, but still the bees wouldn't go away. "It's no good, James," said his driver. "We'll just have to go back to the orchard and fetch another hive." James's reply was drowned by the sound of buzzing. The vicar was waiting anxiously for James. When he arrived, the bees swarmed straight into their new home. "Come on, James," said his driver. "What you need now is a good hose down." Later that evening, James was resting in the shed when the vicar came to see him. "Thank you for saving my bees," he said. "It's a pity it's not Christmas. Then we could call you James the Red-Nosed Engine." Everyone laughed, even James. But instead, they decided to call James the Bee's Knees, which means they thought he was more useful than ever. The island of Sodor had many visitors, and Sir Topham had scheduled more trains. Gordon, the big engine, had to work harder than ever before. "Come on," he called to the coaches. "Come on, come on, come on. The passengers rely on me to be on time." Whenever Gordon finished one journey, it was time for another to begin. "Never mind," he puffed. "I like a long run to stretch my wheels." Even so, Sir Topham had decided that Gordon needed a rest. "James shall do your work," he said kindly. James was delighted. He liked to show off his smart red paint and was determined to be as fast as Gordon. "You know, little Toby," he boasted, "I'm an important engine. Everyone knows it. I'm as regular as clockwork. Never late, always on time. That's me." "Says you," replied Toby. Just then Sir Topham had arrived. "Your parts are worn, Toby, so you must go to the works to be mended." "Can I take Henrietta, sir?" "No. What would the passengers do without her?" Toby saw Percy by the water tower. "Don't worry, Toby. I'll take care of Henrietta until you get back." Soon Toby was out on the main line. He clanked as he trundled along. He's a little engine with small wheels. His tanks don't hold much water. He had come a long way and began to feel thirsty. In the distance was a signal. "Good," he thought. "There's a station ahead. I can have a nice drink and a rest until James has passed." Toby was enjoying his drink when the signalman came up. He had never seen Toby before. Toby's driver tried to explain, but the new signalman wouldn't listen. "We must clear the line for James with the express. You'll have to get more water at the next station." Hurrying used a lot of water, and his tanks were soon empty. Poor Toby was out of steam and stranded on the main line. "We must warn James," said the fireman. Then he saw Percy and Henrietta. "Please, take me back to the station. It's an emergency." Henrietta hated leaving Toby. "Never mind," said Percy. "You're taking the fireman to warn James. That's a big help." Henrietta felt much better. James was fuming when he heard the news. "I'm going to be late." "My fault," said the signalman. "I didn't understand about Toby." "Now, James," said his driver, "you'll have to push Toby." "What, me?" snorted James. "Me? Push Toby and pull my train too?" Grumbling dreadfully, James set off to find Toby. He came up behind Toby and gave him a bump. "Get on, you!" James had to work very hard. When he reached the workstation, he felt exhausted. Some children were on the platform. "Coo! The express is late, and it's got 2 engines. I think James couldn't pull it on his own, so Toby had to help him." "Never mind, James," whispered Toby. "They're only joking." "Huh," said James. Toby just...